Hello, class, and welcome to our lecture on the psychology of personality. Today, we will be focusing on the major historical views of three renowned psychologists: Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Abraham Maslow. Now, each of these psychologists has contributed greatly to our understanding of personality and its development, and their theories have had a significant impact on the field of psychology. So we will explore their views on the structure of personality, the role of the unconscious, and the different stages of personality development. So firstly, we will discuss Sigmund Freud, who proposed that the mind is divided into three components: the id, the ego, and the superego, and that the interactions of these parts and the conflicts among these components create personality. Now, Freud's theory emphasized the importance of the unconscious processes and the impact of early experiences on the development of personality. And because there is the emphasis upon interactions and conflicts, sometimes this perspective is known as the psychodynamic theory of personality. Then we go on to, next we will delve into the work of Carl Jung, who emphasized the importance of the collective unconscious and archetypes in shaping an individual's personality. Now, his theory also explored the concepts of introversion and extroversion and different ways in which people interact with the world around them. And lastly, we will explore the humanistic perspective on personality as proposed by Abraham Maslow. Now, Maslow's theory emphasized the idea of self-actualization and the pursuit of personal growth and fulfillment. His hierarchy of needs suggests that individuals must fulfill basic physiological and safety needs before they can strive for higher levels of personal growth and self-actualization. And so, in some sense, Maslow's theory of personality is based upon the situation and the overall cultural systems in which the person lives. Now, by the end of this lecture, I hope that you'll be able to understand the major historical views of personality and have a better sense of who you are as a person. So, let's dive into the fascinating world of personality psychology. Now, to begin with, as I've already mentioned, we will start off with a little story. And I'd like to just kind of first start off with highlighting what personality is. Now, personality is that relatively stable and enduring characteristics and the enduring behavioral patterns that tend to make up an individual's way of being, the way that they adjust to life and the world. So that gives you a bit of a sense of what we're talking about. Something that is relatively stable over time and is relatively enduring. If a person is a certain way, has a certain way of being when they're 14, those characteristics will tend to be there when they're 25, and they'll tend to be there when they're 50, and they'll tend to be there when they're 80. So what are those kinds of characteristics that tend to be enduring across the lifespan? Then we'll dive into, as I've already mentioned, the Freudian view of personality, the Jungian view of personality, and the humanistic view of personality based upon the perspective of Abraham Maslow. But before we dive into all of that, as always, I want to tell you a little story. Now, this story is a story within a story within a story, because it starts with Plato. Back in the mid-300s BCE, Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher, and he was a student of Socrates. Now, while Socrates did not write anything, Plato wrote about what Socrates did and the teachings of Socrates. And so Plato and Socrates kind of go together. You can't have one without the other, and it's hard to define one without the other. And in fact, some people will have even questioned whether or not Socrates was a real person or not. But be that as it may. Plato founded what is known as the Academy in Athens, which was one of the first institutions of higher learning in the Western world. And Plato wrote numerous dialogues, which are the primary sources of his philosophical ideas and the only source that we have for the ideas of Socrates. Now, one of Plato's most famous dialogues is the Phaedrus, in which Socrates, and Socrates is always, or almost always, the focus of Plato's writings. Socrates and his student, Phaedrus, are discussing the nature of love and the human soul. And in this dialogue, Plato presents the story of a charioteer who was driving a chariot pulled by two horses. One is a wild and unruly horse, a dark horse, and the other a noble and white-behaved horse. And the charioteer represents reason, and the horses represent the human soul. The wild horse represents the passions and desires that can lead a person astray, while the noble horse represents the virtues and values that can guide a person towards a good life. Now, according to Plato's story, the charioteer must use reason to control and guide both horses in the same direction, towards the goal of the good life. If the charioteer fails to control the wild horse, it will lead him off course and towards chaos and destruction. Now, Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, studied a lot of classical Greek ideas, and one of the ideas that he was profoundly influenced by was Plato's idea about the human soul and the struggle between reason and desire. And Freud saw the human psyche as divided into three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id representing the unconscious desires and impulses that drive human behavior, the wild horse. The ego represents reason, the charioteer, and the superego represents morality and social norms. And so Freud used the idea of the charioteer and the horses to explain the struggle between these three parts of the psyche. And he drew upon the ideas presented in Plato, who represented the interaction between Socrates and Phaedrus. So there's a story within a story within a story. All of it going back to ancient Western philosophy. And we hope you see there how the stories of personality and the human soul and the human mind have not changed over time, that what was relevant over 2,000 years ago is still relevant today as far as how people function. So let's dive into Freud's perspective on personality. Now, Sigmund Freud, we've talked about him at the beginning of this course. He was born in 1856 in Austria. It's kind of complicated. He was born in an area called Moravia, and eventually ended up settling in Austria. And is considered to be the father of psychoanalysis, a field of psychology that focuses on understanding the unconscious mind. And Freud's theories have had a profound impact on our understanding of personality and his ideas are still being studied and debated today. In fact, I often use Freud's ideas in trying to understand people. And it's a rough and ready and easy way of kind of understanding how people are functioning. And you don't really have an honest opinion of people until you recognize these basic parts of a personality that Freud highlights. So one of Freud's most significant contributions to psychology is the theory of personality, which he developed through his work with patients suffering from mental illness. Now, according to Freud, the mind is divided into three components: the id, the ego, and the superego. And the interactions and conflicts among these components create our personality. So Freud also introduced the concept of defense mechanisms, which are unconscious strategies that we use to protect ourselves from anxiety and other unpleasant emotions. And these mechanisms include things like repression and denial and projection and displacement and sublimation and others. Now, Freud's ideas on personality have been both influential and controversial. His work has inspired such people as Carl Jung and Alfred Adler, and you can find Jungian and Adlerian institutions all over the world nowadays. And each one of those individuals went on to develop their own theories of personality. But within this lecture right now, I want to focus on that psychodynamic perspective of Freud, and it's called the psychodynamic perspective because of that tension between those three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. So let's begin with the id, which is the component of the personality that forms the basis of our most primitive impulses. Now, the id is entirely unconscious, and it drives our most important motivations, including the sexual drive, libido, and the aggressive drive, the destructive drive, thanatos. And in essence, you can think of the id as operating on what is called the pleasure principle. It wants pleasure within life. And it will constantly want pleasure, and it doesn't really care about anything else. It's interested in pleasure. According to Freud, the id drives this pleasure principle, the desire for immediate gratification of our sexual and our aggressive urges. And the id is why we smoke, why we drink alcohol, why we view pornography, why we tell mean jokes about people, and why we engage in other fun or harmful behaviors, often at the cost of doing more productive activities. Now, in stark contrast to the id, the superego represents our sense of morality and our oughts, our shoulds, the things that we should live up to. The superego tells us all the things that we shouldn't do, or the duties and obligations of society. The superego is our conscience. The superego drives us to and strives for perfection. And when we fail to live up to those demands, we feel guilty. And it's important to note that the superego is not entirely conscious and is also shaped by our experiences and our upbringing and by the values that we've caught from other influences, particularly in early life. Now, let's talk about the ego, which is the larger conscious controller or decision maker personality, the charioteer within the person. The ego serves as the intermediary between the desires of the id and the constraints of society contained in the superego. The function of the ego is based on the reality principle, that idea that we must delay gratification of our basic motivations until the appropriate time with the appropriate outlet. Now, we may wish to scream and yell and hit, and yet our ego normally tells us to wait, to reflect, and choose a more appropriate response. In essence, Freud believed that personality is a result of the dynamic interplay between the id, the ego, and the superego. The id and superego are constantly pushing and pulling at the ego, creating conflicts that we experience as anxiety. To resolve these conflicts, the ego uses various defense mechanisms such as repression, projection, and rationalization to protect the individual from the uncomfortable feelings that arise from the internal conflicts. Moreover, Freud believed that the psychosexual stages of development, which include the oral, the anal, the phallic, and the latent and genital stages, shape an individual's personality and behavior. The way in which individuals resolve conflicts at each stage determines their overall psychological makeup. So, in essence, the psychodynamic perspective personality, as proposed by Freud, the Freudian perspective on personality, highlights the importance of the unconscious and the impact of early experiences on the development of the personality. We have the id, the ego, and superego, and they are constantly at conflict. And the resolution of these conflicts determines an individual's behavior and personality. So if you ever feel like there's a conflict going on inside of you, don't worry. You're normal. That is how Freud would say we are made. And the key is figuring out how to be a good charioteer with the horses that we have been given within ourselves. Now, I hope you enjoyed the lecture up to this point. We're going to pause and take a little bit of a break, and we will come back and explore the other theories, the Jungian theory and the humanistic Maslow theory of personality in the next part of our lecture. You take care, and I hope you enjoy your break. I'll see you in a little while. Goodbye.